So, have you ever stared at your organization's latest KPI dashboard and thought, does this actually capture what my team is even doing? As managers and management students, we're basically trained from day one to trust the data. We just assume that if we can measure a process accurately enough, we'll finally have this perfectly objective view of reality. But what if the numbers you rely on every single day don't really reflect reality? What if they actively construct it? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the really fascinating sociological machinery operating behind the data you use every single day. We'll be drawing directly from the groundbreaking research of sociologists Wendy Nelson Espeland and Mitchell L. Stevens. And honestly, we're going to completely change how you look at a spreadsheet. Okay, let's lay down a quick foundation. Quantification isn't just, counting. It is the production and communication of numbers. Numbers are not naturally occurring facts. It's not like they're apples on a tree that you just walk up and harvest. They're actually complex social artifacts that human beings actively produce. And as a leader, understanding how they're produced is absolutely your secret weapon. Here's our roadmap for today to reveal the hidden mechanics of your metrics. We'll look at 1. How numbers do things. 2. Turning qualities into quantities. 3. The hidden labor of metrics. 4. How measures change behavior. 5. The seduction of data. And 6. An ethics of numbers. Let's get right into it.
All right, Section 1, Numbers Do Things, the illusion of neutrality.
To really grasp this, we're going to borrow a pretty disruptive concept from the philosopher J.L. Austin. He famously argued that language doesn't just describe the world, it acts upon it. Think about saying the words, "I promise." You aren't just describing a state of affairs, right? You're actively creating a totally new reality, an obligation. Well, Espeland and Stevens argue that numbers work the exact same way. Assigning a KPI score or a performance metric acts as a powerful deed. It doesn't just measure an employee's professional reality, it literally alters it. Moving along to Section 2, Qualities into Quantities, the power of commensuration. Let's look at how organizations transform messy, subjective qualities into hard, calculable quantities. There's a big difference between two very different types of numbers here. First, we have numbers that mark. These are just labels, like your employee ID or an office number. They distinguish things, but they don't evaluate them. But then, we have numbers that commence. This is where the magic and, honestly, the danger happens. Commensuration is where managers force wildly different human qualities, stuff like creativity, teamwork, or customer satisfaction, into a single scalable metric so they can be compared. You're taking all that unique difference and transforming it into a flat magnitude. Which brings us to Section 3, the hidden labor of metrics, the infrastructure of counting. Now, commensuration doesn't just happen by magic. Creating those comparable metrics takes an immense, often completely invisible amount of effort. As an executive or a management student, you usually just get handed a clean, beautifully formatted final dashboard. But producing those credible numbers, that requires massive bureaucratic infrastructure, highly trained expertise, relentless discipline, and some serious political muscle. The authors point to the 1800 French census, which totally failed simply because they lacked the centralized, trained labor force to force a divided nation into neat statistical categories. So whether it's a historical census or your company's quarterly earnings report, generating standardized numbers requires massive coordination. Long story short, numbers are work. Okay, Section 4, How Measures Change Behavior, Reactivity and Discipline. So what actually happens when these labor-intensive numbers are finally unleashed onto an organization? The crucial takeaway here is that a measure is never a passive camera taking a snapshot of reality. It intervenes. It absolutely causes people to act differently. The authors highlight Alfred Kinsey's famous 1948 statistic that 10% of the male population was homosexual. Before this, the concept of a gay community didn't really exist in the same way. That single statistic didn't just passively measure behavior, it actually created a new statistical community. It provided this abstract visibility that ultimately catalyzed the modern gay rights movement, transforming individuals into a cohesive political group. Measures literally create new categories of people. For a purely organizational example, take the perfect case study of university rankings. Originally, mass media rankings were created by journalists simply to describe relative school quality for prospective students. Innocent enough, right? But as soon as constituent groups started using them for high-stakes decisions, schools panicked. They completely changed their internal behavior, funneling money and resources specifically just to game those ranking factors.
What started as a descriptive measure became a prescriptive disciplinarian. The metric morphed into the ultimate organizational target. So listen, when you introduce a metric to your team, be fully prepared for it to act as an aggressive disciplinarian. Let's look at Section 5, the seduction of data, aesthetics and statisticism.
What's really fascinating is how we, as managers, are visually and aesthetically seduced by the presentation of metrics. We highly prize graphical excellence, clarity, and parsimony. Take the charts tracking the temperature of Lake Baikal in Siberia. They elegantly compress 60 years of complex, messy, absolutely freezing ecological fieldwork into clean, indisputable facts. I mean, the graph is beautiful, but it entirely strips away the massive, grueling human effort it took to actually collect the data, making the numbers feel like objective truths just handed down from above. Similarly, the famous 1967 Blah and Duncan path diagram brilliantly illustrates how a structured visual can cement incredibly complex, abstract social concepts like human education and intergenerational status into objective, unarguable things. Because it's mapped out with precise decimals and clean little arrows, policymakers and social scientists start treating this complete abstraction as absolute reality. And this visual seduction leads straight into a major managerial pitfall called statisticism. This is the naive delusion that just because you have complex statistical formulas and a slick computing dashboard, you're doing rigorous research or accurately evaluating merit. We become so obsessed with the aesthetics of numbers that we fill our presentations with what design expert Edward Tufte famously calls chart junk. You know, those decorative visual elements that look highly authoritative but actually mask a complete lack of substantive meaning.
Finally, Section 6, an ethics of numbers, rethinking mechanical objectivity.
Once we realize numbers are social artifacts, we really have to rethink how and why we bestow such massive authority upon them. Sociologist Alain Desrosiers identified 4 attitudes people have toward data. As managers, you probably lean heavily on accounting realism or proof in use. Basically, you assume that if the accounts balance or if the software database spits out a plausible chart, then you're looking at absolute reality. But understanding the constructionist view, that 4th row, reveals that these numbers are actually highly negotiated products of human choices. The reality isn't independent of the measurement actively negotiates and produces the reality. Organizations love metrics because they offer what's called mechanical objectivity. They replace messy trust in fallible human beings with a supposedly neutral trust in standardized numbers, specifically designed to limit personal bias. But consider the U.S. federal sentencing guidelines from the 1980s. They tried to eliminate judge discretion by using a strict numerical grid to determine prison sentences. And it was a massive failure. Stripping away all human context to follow a rigid formula produced highly irrational and deeply unfair outcomes, like wildly disproportionate sentences based solely on the chemical weight of a drug rather than the actual context of the crime. And guess what? The discretion wasn't even eliminated. It just shifted to less visible areas, like the prosecutor's offices. If you try to manage your team entirely by strict numerical grids, you won't eliminate human bias for sure. You'll just force it underground. To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this. Numbers are incredible tools. Obviously, they allow us to manage at a distance, coordinate globally, and spot patterns we'd otherwise totally miss. But they are not absolute truth. They are human creations that require immense labor. They change the behavior of the people being measured, and they can visually seduce us into a false sense of certainty. So, the next time you open up your organizational dashboard, enjoying that comfortable illusion of mechanical objectivity, I want you to ask yourself a very provocative, ethical question. Are you measuring what actually matters, or just what is easy to count? Thanks for learning with me today, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.